Hey, so this video is going to be on the little corporal, Napoleon Bonaparte. As you may have guessed, I'm kind of a fan of Napoleon, given that I have a gigantic painting of him sitting behind me, and I have throughout half my videos, except this is the first time I have finally got it hung up. I am terrible at hanging stuff, and the frame on this was relatively expensive, so I didn't want to risk breaking it. And that's why it's been just sitting there for like months on end. But now I've got it hung up, so I figured I'd do a video celebrating Napoleon and discussing whether or not he was an anti-hero, and or maybe even history's greatest anti-hero. So let's get into it. Um, well, before we get into Napoleon, let's just quickly discuss what an anti-hero is. An anti-hero is neither the protagonist nor the antagonist of a story. They are a character that's neither good nor evil, that is at the center of the plot, however, and does a great deal to move the plot of the story forward, which is why anti-heroes are incredibly interesting and incredibly important to the plot of the story. And one can immediately tell by that description that Napoleon Bonaparte, for those who know anything about his life, would be very much an anti-hero in history, given how much he did to influence and develop the plot of history. And now to get into a brief summary of Napoleon's life really quick. He was born on the island of Corsica, just south of France, to minor Corsican nobility, which is how he was able to get a scholarship to go to the French military academy. And he was a good student and graduated and was able to get, therefore, into the cannon division of the French military, which was very difficult to get into and very prestigious. He advanced up the ranks very quickly throughout the military leadership because of his, well, A, because of his talent and his abilities, and B, because he came into it at the right time in the right place, because the French Revolution was going on, which was opening up positions of leadership that had otherwise not been available to people of lower birth like Napoleon, and he was the beneficiary of that revolution. Some of his early victories were against the Italians and the Austrians in southern Europe. And then later he had a victory, well, kind of a half victory in Egypt, where he actually got his navy destroyed by the British, but he still won the battles in Egypt and was able to then later, once he got out of Egypt, parlay that into a major political and propaganda victory in France, where the Directorate was fairly unpopular. And he was able to then be part of a military coup to take over, in which he was eventually installed as first consulate of France, which he turned that later. And then, of course, through both being shrewd as a leader and kind of balancing both positions between the royalists and between the French revolutionaries, he was able to eventually parlay that into being the emperor of France, which gave him near dictatorial powers. Of course, then he really solidified this power later on with his military victories. The Battle of Austerlitz is considered Napoleon's masterpiece, in which he defeated the Russians and the Austrians in a battle in which he was outnumbered and was able to thoroughly exploit their inefficiencies. And he was a great tactician, of course, which is another reason he was able to win. He then later won subsequent battles with the Prussians and the Russians. And so at that point, that was when Napoleon was at kind of the zenith of his power. He implemented a bunch of reforms into France, some of which were good, some of which were bad. He implemented the Napoleonic Code, which to some extent is still used today in France and around the world. And it just shows, what a success it was in terms of establishing law and order. And that was kind of one of the greatest things he did for France, was establishing law and order. He was able to take an anarchic state that was at civil war with itself and turn it into a state that was capable of becoming an empire. However, as his successes grew, so did Napoleon's already very large ego. And he did an unsuccessful invasion of Spain, which, though he did not lose any of the major battles in it, he did. It turned into a situation where the Spanish began to resist, and guerrilla warfare ensued, and atrocities between both sides ensued, and it became pretty much kind of an ulcer to his regime. Of course, then came his infamous defeat in Russia, where he took in 600,000 soldiers that were comprised of both French soldiers and soldiers from other nations as well, the Grande Armée. However, only 93,000 came out, and that was primarily not because he lost any major battles to the Russians, but because he did not prepare for the weather. He lost many due to heat and dysentery going into Russia during the summer. He lost many then, of course, by being stuck in Moscow, which the Russians had burned without any supplies or any winter clothing. And the subsequent retreat, he lost an enormous number of soldiers due to cold, fatigue, starvation, and disease, and continually being harassed by the Cossacks and the Russian armies. By the time he had got back, his army was completely depleted, and Napoleon was pretty much never recovered from that. He fought a lot of battles against the coalition, then which sensed weakness in him. All the European nations once again aligned against him, and this time he was unable to win. At the Battle of Leipzig, he was heavily outnumbered and then did lose that battle, which, even though then later he did try to do a defense of France, he ended up failing and his marshals rebelled against him. And he was then, of course, forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba, which he temporarily ruled after the Bourbon kings had been reimposed back onto France in a constitutional monarchy. However, then Napoleon, both because the Bourbons were not paying him his allowance and because he sensed how unpopular the new Bourbon king was able to come back to France and rally popular support from his former soldiers and from the French citizens themselves and temporarily reimpose himself as emperor again. However, the European nations were having none of it, and they all allied against him again in another coalition in which he was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo by the Duke of Wellington. And this was probably his greatest military loss because he actually had a force that should have been at least comparable to that of the British, and he should have won. But at this point, Napoleon was starting to give out a little bit mentally. Old age was starting to take a little bit of a toll on him, and just bad health that he'd been in. So then he was exiled again, this time to St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he eventually died. Some say stomach cancer, though it's not really certain. But anyways, so now to get into kind of discussion of the legacy of Napoleon and his actions, whether they were good, bad, and if he really was a great person or a great anti-hero or whatever he was. Napoleon, to start off with all of his worst actions first, his worst action is actually usually considered by most the execution of 3,000 prisoners that he had when he was in a battle with the Ottomans. According to the rules of war in the Middle Eastern country that he was based in at the time, it was acceptable to do so. However, it was obviously still a very cruel and cold thing to do. Though it is worth mentioning that most European countries did the same kind of things at that time, so it wasn't just unusual for that time and place. Like the Russians in Napoleon's campaign in Russia had executed a great number of his prisoners of war, or just had not taken care of them well to the point that they died in captivity. And so this kind of thing happened back then, unfortunately. Also, as I mentioned before, he ruled as an absolute dictator when he came to power in France. He did that partially to impose law and order, but he also did it because Napoleon just had no toleration for dissent, and he was very arrogant, and he did not think that his judgment was capable of being wrong very often. And it's partially because he was right a lot. He did have very good judgment on the whole and was quite a leader. I guess some other negative things he did. He was, of course, also towards the latter years of his reign, far too aggressive and very egotistic in his campaigns. I think his Russian campaign, personally, I think that is his worst, not just his worst mistake in his career, but I think that was morally the worst thing on his legacy, because that took a lot of hubris and a lot of obstinance to go forward with that. Everybody had told him, all of his advisors had told him that was a very foolish campaign, and he had no diplomatic objectives. Even if he beat the Russians, he wouldn't have been able to get the Russians to capitulate, because you can't, beat somebody into submission to being your friend, because he was trying to punish them for violating the continental trade system that they were not supposed to violate, and they were trading with Britain. So then even when he got there, though, and he started fighting skirmish battles with the Russians, it was supposed to just be at the Russian border, and never was he supposed to go all the way to Moscow, because he knew he didn't want to get stuck in Moscow in the Russian winter. But Napoleon just lost proportion at that point and kept going further and further in, and that was very both foolish and irresponsible of him, because he was risking 600,000 men's lives. And of course, then the rest is history, what happened after that. But I mean, I think that was to his discredit enormously. And towards the end, there was a number of points where he probably should have surrendered or stopped fighting, but he didn't really know the meaning of the word surrender very well, and many millions of soldiers probably died in unnecessary carnage in battles that he probably should have surrendered towards the end of the war. But that's kind of, I guess you could say, most of the negatives of Napoleon. Now to get into some of the more positive traits which make him so hard to define. Napoleon did a number of things that were either great for France or in the long run great for the world on the whole. One of which was, of course, in the early days, the biggest service he did is he took the anarchy and the civil war of the state of France after the French Revolution, and he put it to an end. He stopped the warring factions of royalists and French revolutionaries who couldn't stop killing each other over everything, and he turned it into a united country under himself. He kept a lot of the better gains of the revolution as well. He kept things like the abolishment of feudalism, the abolishment of privileges, the removal of the Catholic Church's land privileges and their powers within the government as well. However, he also put an end to the mass executions of priests that were going on and the extreme violence against Catholics that were going on in the country, and reinstituted a concordat with the Roman Catholic Church in which it was allowed to be the dominant but not sole religious body of France, which was, I think, to his credit, even as an atheist, I'll give him credit for that. It was probably a smart move to do at the time, both for himself and for France. He also, I should have mentioned this in the negatives column, but just since I'm listing some of his reforms, he reinstituted the slave trade. Obviously, that's a negative. But that was just listing off some of his policies as a ruler. Then some other negatives on that note, though. There was a lot of evidence to believe he was relatively racist, particularly against black people. That's another negative as well. However, he was ironically also not anti-Semitic. He stopped some policies against Jews that were common at the time, like making Jews wear the Star of David to identify themselves. And so he was pretty mixed on some of that in terms of his legacy of what he did. But, the Napoleonic Code that he left behind is still used both in France today and has been a foundation for a number of countries' laws around the world. So it just shows that it was highly positive in its influence. He reinstituted a lot of these reforms into the countries that he conquered, such as the parts of the German territories that he conquered, some parts of Italy, some parts of Spain. I mean, a lot of the ideas of the French Revolution were highly positive, even if the French revolutionaries implemented them in kind of a fanatical way. But I mean, so in a way, he was a bit of a liberator for those who he came to, even if he did so by military force, which is unfortunately sometimes the only way these things can be done. And the reason he was in wars throughout half of his career was because all of the monarchies of France just hated this upstart Corsican, scumbag who had risen up through the ranks, off his merit, not of his blood. And that's why they wanted to depose him and put the Bourbons back into France. So in some ways, I find it hard not to identify with that fighting spirit of, the everyday man fighting against that, the blue bloods. And finally, I think the last thing Napoleon deserves credit for is as a military tactician, he was an absolute master of warfare. He won, I believe, I can't remember, it was 50-something of his 60-something battles that he fought. And a lot of those battles that he lost, were under very rough circumstances. Like the Battle of Leipzig, he was, overwhelmingly overmatched there. And even at the Battle of Waterloo, it wasn't going to be an easy one for him to win. He had a pretty narrow shot in order to win that one. But he won a number of battles in which he was outnumbered as well. And it was partially because he himself was a great tactician, but he also was able to promote marshals and generals that were great tacticians as well, based off of their merit, not off their birth. And a lot of his tactics he used, such as basically marching his opponents to death, being via just simply outmaneuvering the opponents and making his soldiers move incredibly quickly, as well as modern tactics regarding military weapons and other tactics as well. He was truly a master of warfare. In fact, even when he was outnumbered at the end, when all of the nations had ganged up against him, they had a policy, the coalitions of the allied nations of Europe would not attack Napoleon himself. They would only attack his marshals because they knew a direct conflict with Napoleon always resulted in loss, even if he was outnumbered. And they only attacked him when he was just completely overwhelmed and had no chance. And just shows just how unbelievably, tenacious he was, because these were the best generals supposedly in Europe. So I find it hard not to respect that as well. Somebody who is that good at what they do and that it leaves a lasting impact on the world. And he proved what can be done in this world, that any person from any background, if they are intelligent, industrious, and possess other talents in life, can do incredible things. So I think there's a lot of positives to take away from Napoleon's life. However, that's why I would say my overall consensus is that he is an anti-hero, though one that's more good than bad, but definitely an anti-hero above all else. And I attached an Intelligence Squared debate, to this, a link to it, which is where two historians debate this as well. They kind of come to a consensus similar to mine, but one says he's more bad than good, the other more good than bad. But it's pretty interesting. I'd give it a watch if you want to watch it after this. But if you feel differently on Napoleon than this and feel that he was not an anti-hero or a villain or whatever, feel free to put it in the comment section below. And other than that, just thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye.